It was a quite a unique transition in that it was very slow and gradual. So the Mexican transition was probably took a longer, but Brazil was the longest of all of the Southern Cone military regimes. Geisel started talking about liberalization in 1974, and you didn't actually have a civilian president until 85, and you didn't have a full election for president until 89. So it was very gradual. And I think unlike the Chilean transition, for example, it was very informal. It was basically managed by the regime itself, changing the rules when it feared instability, dividing the opposition, and making a lot of deals behind closed doors. So if you read Ronaldo Costa Couto's book about the transition, Tancredo Neves was the first civilian candidate to win the presidency indirectly in 1985. And what he did after he won that election was talk to the military and talk to a lot of other politicians and promise them, look, there will be no revenge. Well, there'll be no trials for human rights abuses. We will make sure that the political elite can smoothly transition from the military regime to the civilian. So that was very unlike what happened in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay, where transitional justice was an issue right from the beginning of the new civilian democratic government. So in Chile, for example, when Aylwin was inaugurated it would have been 1990 after the plebiscite and then the election, you had the mothers of the mothers of the disappeared in the inauguration ceremony for Aylwin. So transitional justice was really front and center in Argentina, in Chile. In Brazil, that was all put off. No talk about how to address the human rights abuses of the past. There was a church report. There was a Brazil Nunca Mais, which is done by the Archdiocese of Sao Paulo. So people knew about the fact that there had been torture. This was kind of demonstrated through the book, but that was not a state policy. That was not an official policy. So I think issues of the past were very muted in Brazil. And it was very much a kind of conversation among elite actors and an informal transition, which kept a lot of things very much as they had been. So if you look at, again, to give the Chilean and Argentine examples, you had Alfonsín come to power in Argentina. He had been a radical lawyer who was opposed to the military dictatorship. You had Aylwin in Chile, who had been a critic of the Pinochet dictatorship. Who was president in Brazil? José Sarney, who supported the coup in 1964, who was a loyal member of the Arena party until just before the indirect election. So the continuities in Brazil are much more pronounced. It's a much more conservative transition where the same people are there in power, a lot of the same policies, and of course you don't have any real attention to the issue of transitional justice until 10 years after the transition. It's not until 1995 under Cardoso that you have this very modest commission that's set up in the Ministry of Justice to look at those issues. To me, that helps explain why today, in 2018, if you, as I did a couple of days ago, I watched the videos that Jair Bolsonaro put on his Twitter feed. His discourse sounds a lot like what was being said in 1964. It's about the unity of the Brazilian family. It's about how the left cannot divide the country. It cannot allow people to, for women to be against men, for Afro-Brazilians to be against white people, for homosexuals to be against heterosexuals. It's a bit like one nation conservatism in Britain, where, there's a view of an organic society, a hierarchy in society. It's patriarchal. It's dominated by the socially more prominent people, and it has a place for everybody, but it rejects what they call activism, which is associated with, kind of being subversive and not being really Brazilian, and it rejects the left. Right? The left is associated with communism and socialism in Venezuela. So it's a paradoxical unity which rejects a lot of people, which excludes a lot of people. And so I think that the nature of the Brazilian transition helps explain why that discourse is still so popular today. And it'll probably have a lot of us in social science going back to that period of the transition from 74 to 89, roughly, to understand it better, to understand how much continuity there was in that transition, and so that the foundation of the democracy was different from some of the other countries. I'm not saying you couldn't have a candidate like Bolsonaro in other countries. I think you could, but there is this interesting link, I think, between the past and the present in Brazil. I think it's a combination of things. I mean, a lot of people in Brazil, now didn't experience the dictatorship directly. They were born either after the end of the regime, or they were very young when it changed, and so they don't have a direct personal experience with it. And they may think that, in the face of the everyday violence of the country, what happened under the dictatorship is not that important. I mean, I don't agree with that view, but some people may say that. I mean, in that sense, the relationship, and this is something I've tried to write about, if you look at the violence in Chile and Argentina, for example, it's the dictatorship violence was very large scale. So the estimates are, 20 to 30,000 disappeared in Argentina, something like 3 to 5,000 in Chile, which is a lot of people compared to the current levels of violence. So if you look at the homicide rate in those countries, it's fairly low. And the dictatorial violence outweighs by many measures the violence today. In Brazil, that relationship is sort of inverted. You had 63,000 people killed in 2017. That's far larger than the largest estimates of how many people were killed and disappeared under the dictatorship. I mean, the Truth Commission came up with a number of about, I think it was 424, in between 400 and 500. So I think that it's not that it excuses the violence of the dictatorship, but it makes it look like it's much smaller in relation to the present than it is in other countries. I think that generates insecurity, and people feel, well, one of the promises of democracy was supposed to be that it would make us feel safer. It would lead to not only liberty of expression and freedom to choose our candidates, but it would bring us some peace, some social peace, and that promise hasn't been realized in Brazilian democracy for whatever reason. It's violence has gone up. The homicide rate has almost tripled since the 1980s, and so when a candidate like Bolsonaro says, he not only praises the dictatorship and talks about that in nostalgic terms, but he says, I'm going to provide you with some security. We're not going to investigate police killings. We're going to be harder. We're going to be harder on criminals. We're going to protect you, the Brazilian family, the mother who's worried about her child. That resonates with people because it seems to match the historical record. Even though you could say, well, there's no evidence that having the police engage in lethal violence actually improves the situation of public security. A lot of the criminological research that's done cannot find a correlation between police who are violent and crime rates that go down. The cause and effect isn't there. But emotionally, psychologically, people respond to that kind of language because it's like, someone is prioritizing my interests and not the interests of criminals. There's been kind of a kind of strange framing of the debate in Brazil where human rights tend to get associated only with the rights of criminal suspects. So human rights are only relevant when a drug trafficker is arrested and the police are not allowed to use violence against him. And so the larger scope of human rights, the rights of people to, all the social rights that are in the Brazilian Constitution, to housing, to health, to education, to mobility in cities, human rights often doesn't get associated with those things. It's only the rights to physical integrity of criminal suspects. and then people say, "Oh, the human rights are for bandits." That's the only thing that they're used for. They're not used to protect us. And that's just that's been the trajectory of the debate about human rights, which again opens the space for a candidate who says, I'm against them, and I'll even pull Brazil out of the UN Human Rights Commission, which is something that Bolsonaro has apparently said.